Hey guys, and welcome back. Now that we have our kubeconfig file generated, let's go ahead and try to authenticate to the server using our Joey config. I'm going to run kubectl, and we're going to do --kubeconfig and set it to joey.config. So now any commands that we run with kubectl are going to be using joey.config that we configured previously. So if we just run that, it's of course going to prompt us for which of these subcommands we want to be using. And instead of using the config command, which is simply allowing us to modify our kubeconfig files, and that doesn't actually communicate with the server endpoint, the API server. So what we need to do is actually run a command that does attempt to communicate with the API server. And one of the ones that you can use just to confirm that everything is working is the version command. So if I just tack on the version command here at the end, you can see that we are able to authenticate to the cluster because we got back the server version information. So what that does is it tells me that we are successfully authenticated to the cluster. However, if we try to run a command like get namespace, for example, you'll see that the user Joey is forbidden to list namespaces on the API server. So what can we do? Well, at this point, we could create a namespace that Joey does have access to, and we'll use a role and a role binding to enable Joey access to a certain namespace. And if you recall from our little diagram that we created right over here, you can see that we are going to have Joey basically be a database manager. So we're going to create a namespace called database using our administrative credentials, which is the default kubeconfig file in .kube/config, which has full access to the cluster. And so we'll create a namespace called database, then we'll create a role and a role binding inside of that namespace that authorizes our Joey user to have access to the database namespace and maybe, manage pods or something like that. So let's go ahead and come back to our terminal here. And so I'm going to use kubectl without kubeconfig parameter, and that's just going to use our default file in .kube/config, and that's our administrative credential. So I'll do kubectl, and we'll do create namespace, and we'll create a namespace called databases. And so now we've created this namespace, and if we do kubectl get ns or get namespace, that should return all of our namespaces, and sure enough, we've got one called databases here. And now what we want to do is delegate access to that database by using a role and a role binding. So let's do a kubectl create, and in this case, we're going to create a role, and the role is going to allow us to specify which permissions we want to add to a particular user. We'll do kubectl create role --help. And we want to do certain verbs, so get, list, delete, patch, things like that. And then we also want to specify the resource types that we want to delegate access to. Now, if you're not sure which resources are available on the API server, you can actually run a command as administrator called kubectl API resources, API-resources, and this will show you all of the different resources that are available on the cluster. Let me just fix the formatting there. So we've got things like pods, we've got things like secrets, we've got things like service controllers, even roles. The role itself and the role binding are actually resources as well. So if you want to delegate access to manage things like services or pods or secrets or anything like that within a given namespace, we can do that in the role configuration. So let's do kubectl create role, and then we need to give it a name, and then we need to specify the verbs as well as the resources that the user Joey should have access to. So let's do a create role and call it database manager, and I'll do --verb equals get, list, create, delete, and for resource, we'll set it to pods. All right, so now we've got this role created, so we could do a kubectl. Actually, I need to create that in a namespace, so let me do kubectl delete role database manager, and then I'll hit up arrow a couple of times, and I'll tack on the namespace parameter. So we'll say namespace databases, because of course we want to put it in our databases namespace. And then now that I've got the role created, we need to create a role binding. And we can do a kubectl create for that as well. If we do kubectl create role binding, let's do that. And then we also need to give that a name. But before we do that, let's take a look at the help for it. And when we do kubectl create role binding, we need to give it a name followed by a user and which role we want it to have access to. So that would be the role parameter here. They don't have an example for that, but basically we'll just use the user and the role parameter to specify which role that user should have access to. All right, so let's do kubectl and then namespace databases dash, and then we'll do create, and then we'll give it role binding and then a name. So let's call this database manager binding. And then we'll do dash dash user equals Joey, and then dash dash role equals, what do we call it? Database manager, I think earlier. Is that what we called it? Yeah, database manager. We'll go ahead and just paste that in. And now we've created this binding. So we could do a kubectl dash dash namespace databases, and we'll say describe all. And it says no resources found, of course, because it doesn't by default show the roles and role binding. So we'll do describe role. And as you can see, we've got a role named database manager with access to get, list, create, and delete pods. And then if we do role binding, describe role binding, you should see that we have a binding named database manager binding, and it's binding the user Joey to the role called database manager. So now if we try to do anything with pods, like creating pods or deleting pods inside of the database's namespace, as the user Joey, we should have access to do that. So let's go ahead and do a kubectl, and we'll specify our kube config. We'll do kubectl dash dash kube config, and then we'll grab our Joey config. So now we're going to authenticate as Joey, and we're going to do get ns, and you can see we're forbidden to list namespaces. However, if an administrator tells us, hey, you have access to the database's namespace, and you can manage pods in that namespace, then we can change the namespace to databases. And of course, I need to specify a command. So let's say get pods, and it says no resources found. Now, what would happen if I tried to list, let's say, services? So we'll say get services, and it says that user Joey does not have access to the services resource in the database's namespace. And that's because our role only gave access to pods, not services. So let's try maybe deployments. Sure enough, it's denied. Let's try replica sets, and sure enough, that's denied as well. However, what if I tried to do a create pod? So we already saw that we could list pods, and of course there are no pods in there because we haven't deployed any. But if we tried to create a pod, let's do a run command, and we'll say run image equals MySQL dash dash port 3306, and I think we can just run that. Oh, let's give it a name like MySQL DB. All right, so we successfully created a pod as Joey, right? So now let's try a kubectl, and we'll just do, in the namespace databases, we'll do get all. And as you can see, it denies us on a bunch of resource types here that are by default returned by the get all command. So get all will return things like replication controllers and services and daemon sets and deployments, replica sets, so on and so forth. But we're denied all of those. However, we have access to list pods, and so that pod is returned to us right here. And so now we could do something a little bit more advanced, like describing the pod. So inside of the database's namespace, still authenticated as Joey right here, we could do a describe pod, and that's going to describe all of the pods inside of this namespace. And of course, we just have the one pod called MySQL DB that's using the MySQL image. And I don't think it's actually going to start up successfully because you have to actually set a MySQL root password in order for it to successfully spin up. However, the point here is that we are able to describe pods as Joey because we gave Joey access using a role. So if we wanted Joey to have access to, let's say, services, right now, Joey does not have access to manage services. However, we could create a second role with service access and then give Joey that access as well, because permissions are additive in nature. There are no deny rules. There's no explicit deny rules. So you're simply adding on additional permissions. So as an administrator, I'm going to leave off kubeconfig, so we're not authenticating as Joey, and we're going to use our default kubeconfig file in this case. We're going to do kubectl --namespace databases, and then we'll do create, sorry, not pod, but create role, and we'll create a role for service manager, let's call it, and then we'll do verb equals get list delete, and I think that's let's do create as well, and then we'll do --resource service, and we'll run that. So now we've got another role. We'll do kubectl namespace databases get role, and now we have two roles. We have service manager and database manager. And now we need to create another role binding. So let's do a create role binding, and we'll call it service manager binding. And then we'll do user equals Joey, and then we'll do role equals service manager. All right, great. And so now if we do a get role binding in that database's namespace, we now have two bindings and two roles. And if we do a describe on the role bindings, we now have two role bindings, and you can see that one is for database manager, user Joey, the other is for service manager, Joey. So now Joey should have the permissions to manage service resources inside of the database's namespace. So let's hit up arrow a few times here and find the Joey config in the database's namespace. So again, we're authenticating as Joey in the database's namespace, and if we do get service, that now succeeds. However, we don't have any services. Let's do create service, and we're going to create, let's say, just a node port service for now. And then we'll do, actually, let's do a cluster IP, and then let's call it MySQL service. And then for our port, let's do --TCP. We'll do 3306 to 3306. And now you can see that we've successfully created a service. However, if we try to manage other types of resources, like if we do a create on something like a deployment resource, let's do create deployment and set the image equal to something like, I don't know, nginx, and we'll call this nginx deployment. As you can see, Joey is forbidden access to deployment. So in order to grant Joey access, we'd have to create additional roles and then bind those roles to Joey, or modify an existing role and add in additional permissions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.